Shalom, I'm Shani Tarragon, and welcome to the podcast Secrets of the Scroll, Hidden Messages of Megillat Esther by Matan Mizrahi, powered by the Walter Foundation. In this series, we're going to explore textual allusions, literary messages that are hidden in the text of Megillat Esther, teaching us messages of not only the story itself, but allusions to the other 23 Sfarim of Tanakh. Please join me on this remarkable journey of learning through Tanakh through the eyes of Megillat Esther. Today we undergo a challenge together, namely revisiting some of the most profound messages of Nevuah from some of the greatest of the core prophets of Jewish history, namely Yeshayahu and Yirmiyahu, and appreciate allusions to their prophecies, both in content and in form, in Megillat Esther, together not only with the prophecies, but also, as we know, with the Ketuvim attributed to Yirmiyahu Hanavi, namely, as it's referred to in Talmudic terminology, Sefer HaKinot, or what we call today Megillat Eicha. Again, initially a compilation of laments, and ultimately read out loud in a public forum from the time of the Gaonim on Tisha B'Av. And that's why I say that today we're going to be more in a sober mindset, and as opposed to necessarily appreciating all the magnificent poetic nuances of Yeshayahu and Yirmiyahu respectively, which aren't necessarily going to textually appear in a Megillat Esther, what we are going to see is that they are clearly referring back to the messages of exile that Yeshayahu and Yirmiyahu not only alluded to, but spoke about time and time again. Yeshayahu in the 7th century BCE, or I should say really the 8th century, from about 787 to 705 BCE during the time of the Assyrian conquest, and then from the years of 627 BCE until 586 BCE, the 40 years of Yirmiyahu Hanavi, from the time of Yoshiyahu through Yehoyakim, Yoyachin, Tzidkiyahu, leading to the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, together with the response of that destruction that he beautifully, poetically depicts through the tragic tunes and the tragic exposition of Eicha Yashva Badad. How can now a city that was once Rabati Am, that was once so full of people, how could Yerushalayim, like a female persona, sit in ruins? So not only do we see, obviously, the feminine motif that we find in numerous Nevuot, particularly those, again, of Yeshayahu as well, referring to also a love relationship between Hashem and Am Yisrael, his famous Mashal HaKerem of Perek Kerem Hayali Didi, referring back to Shir Hashirim, but also Yirmiyahu, who depicts the greatest expression of exile and of destruction through the absence of kol sason v'kol simcha, kol chatan v'kol kala. If people aren't going to get married in Yerushalayim, then they're not going to build homes in Yerushalayim. But ultimately, and if they do, and when they do, and the promise of return to sovereignty, that will be expressed through kol sason v'kol simcha, kol chatan v'kol kala. So what I'd like to do together with all the listeners and learners today is basically focus on some of these ideas that are clearly resonant through prophecy, how we can still appreciate the messages through even the writings without a prophetic voice, without the court of the Beit HaMikdash or the kings of Yehudah, whom Yeshayahu and Yirmiyahu respectively address. How can we still appreciate the messages? Remarkably, we know that the Ashkenazi custom is to read a few psukim in a Megillat Esther to the tune of Eicha. So I'd like to begin with these psukim, where we're going to appreciate not only how they resonate with regard to the tune of Eicha, but how the custom developed clearly because of the resonances, not just of Eicha, but of, unfortunately, the prophecies of destruction that Yeshayahu and Yirmiyahu foretell for the people. But ultimately, they also allude to the possibility of return. So let's internalize not only the music, but also the actual metaphors of prophecy and appreciate through these allusions what the messages are, what the secrets of the Megillah, the secrets of the scroll are coming to teach. We begin with the first, Perek Aleph Pasuk Zayin, which one would hear right away in the context of the party of Achashverosh, the 7-day party that we've already mentioned is really an allusion to Shivati Mehamiluim, to coming back to the Beit HaMikdash. What do we read? We read that the king had displayed during these parties Hashkot Beklei Zahav V'chelim Mikelim Shonim. The kelim in particular, the utensils that Chazal say, these must have been the utensils of the Beit HaMikdash that Achashverosh is displaying to basically mock the people for not returning. So let's pause right now and understand what this has to do with the time period of the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash. Well, we know that Yirmiyahu Hanabi in chapter 25 of the Christian division of his chapters, in Perek Chaf, we hear of the time period of the 4th year of Yehoyakim. And most of the Nivuot of Yirmiyahu appear as focused on this year. The reason for that is because, albeit he becomes a prophet in the 13th year of Yeshayahu in 627 BCE, which is a time of the beginnings of religious reform, unfortunately, by 609 BCE, wonderful righteous Yeshayahu is brazen enough to go to Megiddo and to confront the international battle with Paro Necho on his way to Carchemish to fight against the Chaldeans and the Assyrians. And that's where, again, we're told that Yirmiyahu, in fact, meets him and warns him not to go out to this war. He's killed in this war, which was not just a tremendous political defeat, but a major religious defeat for Am Yisrael in the sense that this righteous individual is killed, which is why his son then, first Yehoachaz, becomes his successor, and he follows the nationalistic desire of his father to maintain autonomy, in which case, as we know at the time, the Paro Necho, the Egyptians who were there, dismiss him because he rebels against them, and as such they appoint his younger brother Eliakim, change his name to Yehoyakim. And Yehoyakim is convinced that through his alliance with the Egyptians, they will come out reigning supreme from the wars of Carchemish, and he thinks that this way he'll be able to succeed militarily, and as such also adopts many of the cultural norms of Egypt. But lo and behold, in 609 BCE, the Chaldeans are the ones who are ultimately triumphant, and as such, they go to the city of Babel, the ancient city of Babylonia. They are no longer going to call themselves Chaldeans, but rather Babylonians. And then they decide that they're going to overtake the area of Yerushalayim, literally center stage along the ancient cultural trade route, and they dismiss or basically strip Am Yisrael of autonomy. This is what we call galut. Galut doesn't just mean that we are outside of our land, but basically that we lose sovereignty in our land. That's when Yirmiyahu comes to the people, and he basically says, you have one last chance. One chance now for tshuva. He composes, we hear in this 4th year of Yehoyakim, he compiles all of his years of nivu'ah in order to encourage the people to do tshuva, and he tells his scribe, Baruch ben Neriah, to go in the month of Kislev when people are fasting for rain, and the people really do seem to start a path and a trajectory of tshuva, only to have Yehoyakim tear up all of the works of Yirmiyahu Hanavi. Can you imagine? Yirmiyahu then says, this is it. This is the end of sovereignty in Yerushalayim and Eretz Yisrael, no longer Judean sovereignty. And he prophesies 70 years of Babylonian regime. And as part of this, he continues his prophecies in a very similar vein as Yeshayahu, close to 130 years earlier, who also spoke about the destruction of the Assyrians when the Assyrians came and destroyed also aspects of Malchut Yehuda, albeit then Chizkiyahu, through his belief and through his davening to Hashem, was able to secure Yerushalayim. But Yeshayahu and Yirmiyahu alike both speak about the kelim, literally the vessels of the Beit HaMikdash, of the treasury, that are going to be taken off in triumph by these foreign kings. And therefore, when Yirmiyahu speaks about not only 70 years of loss of sovereignty, But then he also has to contend against the false prophets. For example, in chapter 28 of Yirmiyahu, in chapter 29, with Hananiah ben Azor Hanavi, who after then in 597, the aristocracy of Judea has been exiled by Jehoiakim's successor, his son Jehoiachin, who rebels against the Babylonians and is exiled with the Kohanim, with the monarchy, with the Kelim of Yerushalayim. Hananiah ben Azor says, don't worry, the Kelim are going to return within 2 years. Again, which they don't. Yirmiyahu has to say it's going to take 70 years. But wait a second. We discussed that both according to Chazal and certainly according to, again, most historians, the story of Esther takes place after those 70 years have expired, after 535 BCE. It's either after Koresh or after Daryavesh, but whatever the case may be, these Kelim should be back in Yerushalayim. And that's exactly what Mordechai and Esther are saying. They're revisiting the Nevuot of Yirmiyahu. Read them as if we're still in exile, even though we don't have to be in exile. Read this as part of our exile, the Chelim Shonim, that one is looking at the various vessels of the king's culture and the king's palace instead of those of the Beit HaMikdash. So, of course, we're supposed to bring ourselves back to the tune of Eicha, to the tune of exile, recognizing we're still in exile, even though Yirmiyahu had promised us that we'd have the option of return. So let's continue to the next stage where, once again, instead of a prophetic voice, we're going to hear narrative silence, but the tunes of Eicha resonate to ensure that that silence speaks of the dearth and the vacuum in our lives as well. So we continue to Perek Bet. Perek Bet, Pasuk Vav, we read the introduction of Mordechai. Ish Yehudi haya b'Shushan habira, ushmo Mordechai, ben Yair, ben Shimi, ben Kish, ish Yemini. Asher hagla Yerushalayim im hagola, asher haglata im Yechonia melech Yehuda, asher hagla Nebuchadnezzar melech Bavel. And therefore, if there is any resonance of the Nevuot of Yirmiyahu, here you have it. In Perek Bet Pasuk Zayin, the authors here, Mordechai and Esther, want to make sure that we go back to the Nevuot of Yirmiyahu. And remember, you want to know who Mordechai is? He's the son of Yair, the son of Shimi, the son of Kish from Binyamin, who was exiled from Yerushalayim with the Gola, with the exiled that were exiled during the time of Yirmiyahu Hanavi in 597 with Yechonia, the king of Yehuda, during the time of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, please keep in mind that this is at least, according to historians, again, at least 110 years earlier. Again, according to Chazal, again, closer to about 70 years earlier, but whatever the case may be, again, still revisiting those scenes described in Yirmiyahu of the Galut of Yehoiachin. So much so that when we first read the Pasuk, it seems that Mordechai himself was exiled with Yehoiachin, which would make him very old during the story. And therefore, it seems that it wasn't Mordechai, but rather his great-grandfather Kish, who was exiled with the aristocracy, which makes sense because someone from Binyamin living in the areas of Yerushalayim, the southern borders of Binyamin, would be exiled together with the other inhabitants of Yerushalayim, who are predominantly people from Yehuda. So this isn't just a technical pasuk. This is really one that's telling us, oh my, we're revisiting the exile. So much so that we can even hear, perhaps, the words of Kish to his great-grandson, Mordechai, maybe Matala he called him. And he would say, I remember, Mordechai, that once upon a time I lived in Yerushalayim and I was exiled by Yehoiachin, as if to say here in Megillat Esther, but don't worry, because Yirmiyahu said that one day we're going to go back, one day we're going to return. So much so that our sense is that if this is after Hatzarat Koresh, the proclamation of Koresh, then they should have returned. And therefore, Mordechai and Esther incorporate this pasuk as if to say, yes, we're reliving the Galut. By not returning to Eretz Yisrael, we're choosing to stay in Galut Yehoiachin, in the exile of the monarchy, of the aristocracy. Interestingly, in Sefer Ezra, and we see that there was someone named Mordechai who returned. Maybe Mordechai did return with Koresh and then came back, perhaps to take care of his cousin Esther, the orphan, or perhaps in order to serve as a shaliach b'nei Akiva, to encourage everyone else to come back to Eretz Yisrael. Whatever the case may be, We read this to Eicha because we hear that exile. We hear the desolation. We hear about the desertion, literally, of the people being left alone outside of their homeland, outside of Eretz Yisrael and Yerushalayim. So, of course, Mordechai and Esther, in the same state as they were 70 years ago, have to revisit these prophecies, have to revisit the lament, have to basically encourage Am Yisrael to wake up and say, you can change your locale, you can change the location. And what happens in a state of exile? You're going to see all the prophecies of Yeshayahu and Yirmiyahu, the prophecies of Chorban. You're going to see them reenacted. You're going to see how they'll be realized again, which is what brings us to the next of the psukim that clearly resonate with not only the tune, but with the meaning of the previous prophets. So we turn to Perek Gimel, Pasuk Tetvav, and when we hear about the dangers of exile, not only the rise of anti-Semitism, but the possibility of genocide. Again, Perek Gimel, Pasuk Tetvav. Easily, imagine this, that in the third year of Achashverosh, which is how the story of the Megillah begins, it seems that all the Jews of Shushan were invited to the 7-day royal party in the Chatzar Gina Pitan HaMelech. And then, by the 7th year, a Jewish princess, again, Esther, is going to be coronated as the queen. Within 5 years of that time, Haman is going to be promoted. And then, within just a few months, think about the entire story of Megillat Esther occurs over the course of 9 years. And most of the events, beginning in Perek Gimel, over the course of 1 year, in the 12th year of Achashverosh, somehow Haman is able to easily convince Achashverosh that it's worthwhile, certainly economically, even politically, to get rid of this Am Achan Mufuzar Umufurad Bein Ha'amim, which is the perfect depiction of what exile is, literally losing sovereignty and identity in the land. So now we're dispersed. We don't have that national identity. People don't recognize us as much, especially because we don't even have a fully religious and orthodox, again, unified dat that people are observing. And therefore, not only does Haman convince Achashverosh very quickly, but Achashverosh gives him his Tabat HaMelech and sends out to all the countries Sfarim, heralding the genocide of the Jewish people on the 13th of the 12th month of Adar. And then the next pasuk tells us that as these letters were sent out to all of the 127 lands, Haratzim yatzu tchufim b'dvar hamelech v'hadat nitna b'shushan habira. V'hamelech v'haman yashvu l'shtot v'ir Shushan navocha. These are terms even. Again, the navoch, the confusion, that we see also in Eicha, in the Kinot, how the people are just confused. They're in a stupor. They're in a shock. And therefore, Mordechai and Esther say, oh my, we're revisiting exile. We're revisiting exile right now because we know that the letters went out, as the chapter tells us, they went out in the month of Nisan. They went out on Yud Gimel Nisan, on the 13th of Nisan, B'chodesh Harishon B'shlosha Asar Yombo. So if you're not convinced that Megillat Esther resonates with the messages of Yirmiyahu in particular, then we're going to prove it right now. Not only from this pasuk of Ha'ir Shushan Navocha, reminiscent of the stupor post-destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, but also now if we turn to appreciate how long Am Yisrael, how long the Yehudim during this time were living literally gripped with fear of genocide. The letters go out on the 13th of Nisan, and the second set of letters that allow for the defense of the Jewish people so that it won't just be Kristallnacht, so that they won't just go as sheep to the slaughterhouse. Again, those we're told about in chapter 8, in Perek Chet, Pasuk Tet, Vayikaru Sofrei HaMelech Be'itahi, V'chodesh HaShlishi, Hu Chodesh Sivan, B'shlosha ve'esrim bo, The letters are not repealed, but there's an amendment that goes out on the 23rd of Sivan. So let's do the calculation together. This is remarkable. From Yud Gimel Nisan to Yud Gimel Iyar, 30 days, they still thought, oh my, and in just 11 months from now, basically, we're all going to be annihilated. Those are the first 30 days. Yud Gimel Nisan, Yud Gimel Iyar to Yud Gimel Sivan. That's already 60 days. And then we have another 10 days until they receive letters that they can defend themselves, and there is the possibility of salvation. And by that time as well, we know by then Mordechai has been taken through the streets as a prominent representative of the king. And by now, Haman has already been demoted. So we clearly see his SS offices have already been handed over to Mordechai as well. He's been hanged soon. Again, his sons will be hanged as well. And therefore, we already get a sense, wow, for these 70 days, they all thought that they were going to be killed. It's only after Chav Gimel Sivan when the Jews are much more optimistic, knowing that they can defend themselves under much more hopeful circumstances. For 70 days, we thought that we were going to be killed. This is clearly Mordechai and Esther alluding back to the 70 years of Yirmiyahu, perhaps teaching us that if you don't internalize the messages of Galut, if you don't understand that when you're stripped of national identity, it's a punishment, as Yeshayahu and Yirmiyahu tell us over and over again, for not properly appreciating your religious identity. Then when you have an opportunity to return to both religious identity and national autonomy, you're supposed to take advantage of that. That's Parshat Teshuvah of Devarim Perek Lamed. And in Devarim Perek Lamed, we hear that that's the state of full teshuvah, a full end of exile. If that's the case, then after 70 years, already 535 BCE, the Jews could have returned. What Mordechai and Esther are writing is literally a synopsis of Yirmiyahu. Because we didn't return when we should have returned, so now we're going to relive the exile of 70 years. But a famous tone in Tanakh, as we also see from Yecheskel, is Yom L'Shana, Yom L'Shana. We were punished for 40 years in the Midbar, for 40 days that the Meraglim toured and unfortunately spoke negatively about Eretz Yisrael. Yecheskel Hanavi has to stay on his side in oppression for 430 days, reminiscent of 430 years of iniquitous behavior of Am Yisrael. So perhaps we have to experience or re-experience 70 days of Galut to remember 70 years of exile. So here we have another resonance of Yirmiyahu. But let's go back to the psukim of not just the end of Perek Gimel, but then we hear the response of Mordechai in Perek Daled. O Mordechai yadat kol asher nasa, vayikra Mordechai begadav, vayilbash sak vayifer, vayitei b'toch ha'ir, vayizak zakah gedola umara. These are words that are also read to the tune of Eicha, reminiscent of the cries of Yeshayahu, the cries of Yirmiyahu, the cries of Tshuva that we should have yelled out much earlier. Vayavo ad lefnei shar hamelech ke'en lavo shar hamelech belevush sak, and the wearing of sackcloth that we hear at the very beginning of Eicha as well. Again, the mass, the labor tax, Eicha yashav badad ha'ira batiyam, hayta ka'almana. All of her beautiful jewels and garments that are described at the beginning of Eicha of Yerushalayim, depicted as a woman, and now Hayta Lamas. Now she's going to be a sak. She's going to wear the sackcloth, exactly the terminology that we hear also in Megillat Esther. And therefore, it actually continues again in this chapter in order to tell us the tune of Eicha should still be resonating in our hearts, in our minds. Let's continue again to the next pasuk. Uvachol medina medina mekom asher dvar hamelech v'dato magia Evel gadol la-Yehudim. We're supposed to hear the Evel of Eicha, v'tzom uvachi umesped sak va'efer yutza larabim. Again, that tune of lament, the kina, not only the liturgical tune, not only the cantillation, but ultimately the imagery that Mordechai and Esther are depicting for us as well. We continue in Perek Daled, Pasuk Tet Zayin, another pasuk of reverberations of prophecy. ותאמר אסתר להשיב על מרדכי, לכנוס את כל היהודים הנמצאים בשושן, וצומו עלי, ואל תאכלו ואל תשתו 3 ימים, לילה ויום. גם אני ונערותי עצום כן, ובכן אבוא אל המלך אשר לא כדת. And I think we know this one all by heart. וכאשר עבדתי, אהבדתי. And she basically says, and it may not end well. Now, please keep in mind that Mordecai and Esther are writing the story after the events happen, but they want to bring us back to that state again of Eicha. V'kasher avadati avadati. Esther recognizing that this is what happens in a state of galut. Individually, collectively, nationally, we are all facing the possibility of demise. She realizes that because of the state in which she's in, just as Yeshayahu and Yirmiyahu spoke about, they spoke about empires taking over. They spoke about our submission, our subservience to the kings, not just of Ashur, to the kings, as we know, of Bavel, of Nebuchadnezzar, of Di. And that's exactly what she says, Kasher avadati. The same terminology also of Sefer Dvarim, abeto, bedun, the words that were used to talk about our destruction of the nations of Canaan. And now she says, we're the victims. Again, we now are the ones, just as Yeshayahu and Yirmiyahu spoke about. We're the ones who may be lost. We're the ones who are now in that state of exile. We're the ones whom Hashem promised us that kol, literally, Avdim, all the ones who were lost and scattered throughout the lands are meant to return to the land of Eretz Yisrael. She says, right now I'm in a state of exile, and I really may be lost. And I know, now we appreciate that when Mordecai told Esther that you have an opportunity to stand up. You have an opportunity to help end not only this genocide, but even end this exile of the people, encouraging them after a time of terror to return now with the 42,360 Jews who have returned to Eretz Yisrael. Tell them to return. Tell them that this is the end of the exile that Yirmiyahu spoke about. And tell them, Esther, that yes, this is an opportunity to, as he says, Revach vatala yamod layudim mimakom acher. He says, I know that the Jewish people are going to be fine because there is a makom acher. There is another place. There is a population of Jews living in Yerushalayim. And hopefully, if we hear the echoes of exile, if we hear the echoes of nevuot that should have been realized, that should have come true, then, just as we know throughout history, hopefully this will empower us, will inspire us, will energize us to, in fact, act upon the fulfillment of these nivuot. And now we turn to the last resonance of Eicha, to the last pasuk that we read to the tune of Eicha that reminds us of the nivuot of Yeshayahu and Yirmiyahu in particular. And that is Perek Chet pasuk Vav. Esther stands before the king. She already has not only accused Haman, but convinced Achashverosh vayitlu et Haman ala etz asher hechin leMordechai v'chamat hamelach shachacha. The house of Haman is already in the hands of Mordechai, and yet Esther comes again before the king. Vatipol lifnei raglav vatevka vatitchanin lo lavir et ra'at Haman hagagi vet machshavato asher chashav al hayudim. And she thinks this is it. Again, a time for salvation. She turns to the king, and we read this pasuk with the tune of Eicha to remind us that even when there is partial salvation, we are still in exile. And if you're not convinced, then this time it's not just the tune, but it literally is the textual proof that we're also revisiting Eicha. Esther pleads, Ki eichacha uchal b'ra'iti b'ra'a asher yimsa et ami. She doesn't just say ech, but she cries that cry of lament. Eicha, eichacha. How can it be that I shall be here to see what befalls my people? She wants to make sure that there isn't going to be a war against the Jews. Ve'eichacha uchal v'ra'iti ba'ovdan moladati. She doesn't just say, how can I see literally the evil that may befall my nation? She adds, ve'eichacha, the eicha of ra'iti, ba'ovdan, literally that word of kasher avadati, ba'ovdan moladati, literally my homeland, my moledet. She refers to the fall even of Eretz Yisrael. This is clearly revisiting the Nivuot of Yeshayahu and Yirmiyahu. She says that we have to plead before the king, not only Achashverosh, where we're going to always be submissive and exile to the powers of the governments in which we find ourselves, but also before HaKadosh Baruch Hu. How can I see the evil of exile of my homeland? She revisits all of Eicha, the destruction of Eretz Yisrael, the destruction of Yerushalayim. And therefore, we end this very sober podcast, this very solemn one as well, with reflection. That while we read on one hand, La Yudim Haita Ora V'Simcha V'Sason Bikar, that when we hear about Bin Hafochu Asher Yishletu Hayudim B'Sonehem, that everything seems to be inverted, and now we're in control, we're reminded by the ends of the Megillah that we're not, that in exile we can only reach the status of Mishneh Lamelech, of second in command. We have to remember the end of Megillat Esther ends with a mas, ends with a tax, a labor tax, a fiscal tax, the way that Eicha begins with a mas. The way that Yeshayahu speaks about the mass of burdens in exile. And therefore, Mordechai and Esther are teaching us that even when there's salvation in exile, it clearly is only a partial salvation. It's a temporary salvation. We are still outside of our land. The lack of sovereignty is something that must be mourned. And in addition, even when we do have Ora v'Simcha v'Sason Bikar, it's not the complete restoration of Kol Sason v'Kol Simcha, Kol Chatan v'Kol Kala. We're still missing something. So we turn to Megillat Esther, and we realize that Megillat Esther stands at the far edge of prophecy. It doesn't deny destruction. It doesn't deny the situation of the Jewish people at the time, some of whom have gone back to realize the redemption and restoration of sovereignty, and the majority of the Jewish people who decide to stay in a state of exile. Instead, what it does teach us is how to live faithfully after devastation. It teaches us that when God no longer speaks through prophecy, when kings no longer listen, that there still is the possibility of salvation, which ultimately is a call for the full redemption. By chanting the psukim of this seemingly happy Megillah to the tune of Eicha, Mordechai and Esther remind us that Jewish memory remains whole, so that if the end of Eicha leaves us with Zechor Hashem Mahayalanu, that Hashem, you have to remember the destruction to make sure that one day we return. Mordechai and Esther say, please let the words of the Nevi'im, let the messages that reverberate through prophecy of God, let them stay in your hearts and minds. And this time, V'zichram lo yasuf mizaram. Not only the memory of Purim, not only the memory of the dangers of exile, but the memory of devastation, the memory of despair, the memory of danger should in fact arouse all of us to return, to fulfill all of the nivuot of destruction, transform them to prophecies of return and of redemption.
Thank you for joining us for Secrets of the Scroll with Rabbanit Shani Targin. This series is presented by Matan and World Mizrahi and powered by Walder Foundation. We hope today's conversation inspired you, sparked new ideas, and deepened your connection to the text and its meaning. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends or family who would appreciate these conversations. Your support helps us continue bringing thoughtful, meaningful Torah to the wider audience. We look forward to learning together again soon. See you in the next episode of Secrets of the Scroll with Rabbanit Shani Targin.